Freedom of expression is a much discussed topic in the public discourse of Sri Lanka right now. Many are talking about protesting, writing, posting on social media, and generally expressing their views and dissent. With that comes the question, do we really know what freedom of expression is? How do we distinguish it with hate speech? And in an event of it being violated, what are the remedies do we have? To serve this purpose, we have initiated a line of discussions with experts under the name Janamatayata Vedikava. In today's episode, we have Ms. Harindrini Correa joining with us. Ms. Harindrini Correa is an attorney at law involved in litigation and research. We warmly welcome you to today's episode.
Thank you.
Ms. Harindrini, now tell us about freedom of expression. How does it affect the health of a democracy?
In a healthy democracy, it is very important to have consensus-based policy. We need to have the views and opinions of different groups in society. We need to encourage public debate. And so protest and freedom of expression plays an important role in especially providing a voice for the most marginalized, oppressed communities as well, to have their voice and their opinion heard of what they expect of their state in a democracy.
Can you explain how freedom of expression is guaranteed in the Constitution of Sri Lanka?
Article 14(1)(a) of our Constitution provides that every citizen is entitled to the freedom of speech and expression, including publication. Article 14(1)(b) also provides that every citizen is entitled to be part of a peaceful assembly. These rights in our Constitution, the freedom of expression internationally, is recognized in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Is freedom of expression an absolute right? What are the limitations that it has?
So the freedom of expression that we find in Article 14(1)(a) of our Constitution is restricted by certain provisions in Article 15. So Article 15 provides that restrictions as prescribed by law in the interests of racial or religious harmony, parliamentary privilege, contempt of court, defamation or incitement of an offense are applicable.
Could you describe how governments in power have misused this provision to curtail the freedom of expression, and how has it affected the civil society in general?
So we've seen many examples documented, especially by legal academics, of provisions in the Penal Code and the ICCPR Act which have been misused and which have been used to curtail freedom of expression under the pretext of many other things. So if we go into a few of these examples, we look at Section 120 of the Penal Code. So Section 120, that provision, it makes it an offense to raise discontent, disaffection or hostility to the state amongst different groups of people. We have a case in the Supreme Court, SCFR 768 of 2009, which has drawn a distinction between words that will incite violence and words that will defame. So we've seen Section 120 being used to arrest people. We've seen it being used during the pandemic, where people have used their social media to criticize decisions the government has made in response to the pandemic. So that's an example there where we've seen the use of a provision to curtail freedom of expression. We've also seen the use of Section 291(a) and (b), which look at making an offense of wounding or insulting religious feelings. And those provisions have also been used to arrest people. So we have instances of authors like Shaktika Satikumara with his short stories, who was arrested. One of the charges was under Section 291, actually, of the Penal Code. Then we have people like Mr. Ramzi Razik for a Facebook post, social media post, who was arrested. So this is while expressing, so with Shaktika, while expressing his creative expression in the form of his stories, or with Mr. Ramzi Razik while expressing his opinions on a Facebook post. We've also seen with Anaf Jazim, the poet, being arrested, and that was also under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is another act that we've seen being used to arrest, for example, like the poet, curtailing his freedom of expression. And as mentioned before, during the pandemic, we saw that there were individuals expressing criticism of the government, which is part of your right to free expression who were also arrested. In one such particular instance, we had a lady who was arrested for sharing a social media post about President Gotabaya Rajapaksa being hooted at. And in this instance, again, this was a violation of a freedom of expression in the guise of or in the context of saying do not criticize government officials.
I think it's quite ironic how an act like ICCPR Act, which is meant to protect civil liberties and rights, is misused to actually violate them. So on that note, what are the international instruments that are used to protect freedom of expression in Sri Lankans?
So with international instruments, it is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that lays down freedom of expression. And with Sri Lanka being a dualist state, we then have the convention enshrined in domestic legislation, which is the ICCPR Act.
How important is freedom of expression for the media and journalists in general, and also for the informed citizenry?
Yes, so under Article 14(1) of our Constitution, it is also a fundamental right to practice your occupation. And so for a journalist, it is their right to be able to practice their occupation. They also are entitled, as stated before, 14(1)(a) to freedom of expression, which includes publication. And so it is very important for media to be able to obtain information and to be able to impart that information to members of the public.
Would you be able to elaborate a bit more about vital cases that are on freedom of expression?
Yes, so there have been many judgments, and particularly with the Supreme Court, where they've upheld the right to freedom of expression. And I'm just going to look at a few of those right now. In Deshapriya and Another versus Municipal Council, Nuvareli and others, the court stated that the right to support or to criticize governments and political parties, policies and programs is fundamental to the democratic way of life. And democracy requires not merely that dissent be tolerated, but that it be encouraged. In SRFR applications in 2008, it was specifically laid out that the nature of expression being political is certainly not a criterion recognized in the Constitution to limit freedom of expression. In Joseph Pereira versus Attorney General, it was stated that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government. Such debate is not calculated and does not bring the government into hatred and contempt. And we also have the famous Jana Gosha case, in which it was stated that stifling the peaceful expression of legitimate dissent today can only result inexorably in the catastrophic explosion of violence on another day.
In an event of freedom of expression being violated, what are the mechanisms, national or international, that are available for journalists, activists, and citizens in general that they can seek justice?
Legal recourse in the form of filing a fundamental rights action when your right to freely express yourself has been violated is one such remedy that can be taken. Internationally, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there is the option under an optional protocol to be able to submit an individual complaint to the Human Rights Committee in Geneva.
In this day and age, internet is widely used by many of us. How is freedom of expression used in this platform, and what are the limitations that are there?
Yes, so we see many people, particularly during the pandemic, we saw this in 2020 and 2021, using social media platforms to be able to express themselves, and also importantly to be able to criticize decisions of government, which is a vital part of a healthy democracy. So along with people expressing their opinions, this included criticism of the cremation policy. This included criticism of presidential task forces that were set up, and those who were set up to run those who were appointed to run those task forces. This included criticisms on quarantine centers and various rules that were set up. So we saw that many people who expressed their opinion on whatever was going on at that time also received intimidation, and there were many who were arrested as well. So these arrests were a violation of their fundamental right to express themselves. We saw a trend at censoring dissent and even attempting to criminalize dissent on social media platforms.
With that comes the question, how do we draw a line in between hate speech and freedom of expression? So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. So looking at the ICCPR Act, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act in Sri Lanka, Section 3.1 defines the offence of hate speech. This is defined as propagating war or advocating for racial, religious, or national hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, violence, or hostility. When considering the elements of this offence that is set out, particularly in Section 3.1, we have a letter that the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka submitted to the Inspector General of Police in 2019 on how Section 3 should be interpreted and applied. And in this letter, the Human Rights Commission has referred to the need to look at international jurisprudence under Article 20 of the ICCPR in interpreting Section 3. And there, a valid element is to look at intention. And so a fundamental difference or a fundamental way that we would distinguish between freely expressing yourself, perhaps creatively, perhaps with criticism, and hate speech is looking at the intention of someone. So if we think about Arnaf Jazim, if we think about Shaktika Sadikumara, and we think about creative expression, we really have to ask the question there whether there was intention to incite violence, hostility, or discrimination. The letter from the Human Rights Commission to the IGP also looked at the use of the ICCPR Act, the selective use in certain instances on the pretext. The letter, in addition to looking at how Section 3 should be interpreted correctly when being applied, also looked at the omission of the state in situations where the Act should have been applied or could have been applied. And this is an important factor that we need to consider as well, to look at what are the instances in which there has been all the elements of the offense satisfied, and particularly where there has been intention to incite violence or hostility, and in those instances why the Act is not applied, where there haven't been any arrests, when there has been this alleged claim of hate speech with all the elements satisfied. And the letter also specifically did note that this then amounts to omission by the state. And so this is arguably a tacit state approval of hate speech. And so this is another area that we need to look into.
What is your take on different tactics that are used by the civil society to express their dissent?
If we take the recent example of the protests we've had at Goa Face and around the island in different neighborhoods with neighborhood vigils, and the large-scale protest, this seems to be an example to the entire world of a very unique, peaceful assembly with multiple parts to it. So we had the People's University, we had the library, we had the kitchen, we had the legal aid truck, we had tents which were set up by different groups of people coexisting in that space that they were occupying. So this was also part of this peaceful assembly. We had music, we had song, we had acting and drama and theater. So this was, we've seen months of very creative tactics, very out of the box and unique ways that civil society and members of public, including teach out sessions, have been relying on to express their dissent. Certainly in a way that can be used as an example around the world of peaceful dissent.
I'm sure you learned how to exercise your freedom of expression within your legal boundaries and without crossing the line of hate speech. Thank you, Ms. Harendrani Korea, for joining with us today. And we will join you with another episode on freedom of expression. Thank you.